Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that rapturous reception. I'm delighted to welcome all of you, and especially our speakers, Jung Chang and Jon Snow, on the first day of our 25th anniversary Charleston Festival. Jung Chang is the author of Wild Swans, based on her upbringing in China during the Cultural Revolution, which took the world by storm in the 1990s and shattered any Western illusions about Mao's Little Red Book. She followed her memoir by an immensely influential biography of Mao, The Unknown Story, which she discussed at the Charleston Festival when it was first published nearly a decade ago. So we're particularly thrilled to be able to that she's able to join us again this year to talk about her new book, her subsequent book, a biography of the complex Empress Cixi, a grade 3 imperial concubine who rose to supreme power in the Manchu Empire for the best part of 40 years. Like any absolute ruler, the Empress's reputation was controversial. Was she a modernizer? Was she a murderer? Was she both? Who better to help to discuss her contradictions with Jung Chang than Jon Snow, one of our most distinguished broadcasters, whose role on Channel 4 has taken him to hotspots around the world, where he's been at the epicenter of many international upheavals. I'm delighted to hand over to Jon Snow and Jung Chang.
Well, let's get some throat clearing done first. I mean, I know, in common with my, only younger people will know this joke, in common with my cinematographic character, Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, I know nothing about Chinese history. But actually, that is what made this book so absolutely gripping. It's a sensational book. The second thing we need to identify is what Jung is wearing, because what she is wearing is in fact a tapestried dress which is absolutely of the period and from the period, it is that age in which she lived. This amazing woman, not you, Cixi, in which Cixi lived, and that period, she died in 1908, which is an amazing thought. She died 5 years after my father was born, so this is a woman who informs the 20th century in many ways. It's a most extraordinary, eye-opening book. So, and we'll try to share a little bit of why. But first of all, let's just look at this woman. Take a look at her feet, for a start. Yes. Bound, and the fingernails. She clearly never did a job of actual work. But she never washed up.
Well, she never washed up, that's for sure. And she never dressed herself because Manchu, she was a Manchu lady. And the Manchu lady wear, sort of sleeves, very wide sleeves. And they never needed to have short fingernails. So they grew long fingernails. And of course, her fingernails were also protected by fingernail shields. Now, her feet were not bound because she was Manchu, which was an ethnic minority from northeast China. And she escaped foot binding, which only applied to Han women.
But the shoes look like the sort of socks of a grand piano. I mean,
yes, but
the wheels go into.
I'll show you the real bound feet shoes, because her shoes, if you could see, have a square front that actually makes the feet quite comfortable to be in. And the elevation is in the middle. So she walked a bit like on stilts. But now these were real foot binding feet. I mean, only the big toe was allowed to grow, and the foretoes and the arch were crushed under a big stone, and the binding was just to stop the broken bones from recovering. This was my grandmother's shoe, and my grandmother was my height, and it was the Empress Dowager Cixi who banned the foot binding because she hated foot binding, and she always cringed when she saw bound feet, and that's how I first got interested in her. Because when I was researching wild swans, I had thought that foot binding was banned by the communists, because I grew up in communist China, and that was the propaganda. And then I was astonished to realize that it was the Empress Dowager who banned foot binding, and that got me interested in her more than 20 years ago.
Now obviously, the most exciting and extraordinary thing about her is her origins, is that she was a concubine. So
Yes.
we have to explain the role of the concubine, how a concubine could ever conceivably have become the Empress of China.
Right. Well, she was born in 1835. When she was 16 years old, she went through one of those periodic nationwide selections for imperial concubines. So she was paraded in front of the emperor, like hundreds of girls from all over China. And she caught the eye of the emperor. And if I may show you. Do I get?
Yes,
oh, that's
it's
her
all right.
husband, the emperor, and she caught his eye, and she was made one of the imperial concubines. But a concubine had no status, she gave birth to a son. This is not their son. I'll tell you what. Shall I tell the story of the dog? This is not their son. This was actually the ancestor of the Pekingese dog. Because when the British invaded China in 1860, and Cixi and her husband fled the summer palace to North China. And an elderly imperial concubine didn't get to flee, and so he died. And the British found these 5 Pekingese dogs around her body, and they brought them back. And this one was named Luti. And she was presented to Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria had Luti painted. And now, okay, so the 5 Pekingese dogs. Okay,
But
now her
you
son.
just mentioned something which in a way helps to put all this into perspective, because we all grew up with the concept that there was only one great woman around in the 19th century, and that was Queen Victoria.
Yes.
We were told absolutely nothing about it, Cixi.
Yes.
And it came to me as a huge shock that somebody had not only become the Empress of China to the exclusion of male, I mean, never to the exclusion because she kept these guys on a string, but that somebody who'd been a concubine became the Empress of China.
Right. I mean, she gained power because that was her son, the boy in blue. She bore the only son for the emperor. But even with the fact that she bore him a son, she had no status. When the emperor died, and her son succeeded to the throne at the age of 5, the empress was supposed to be the mother, the Empress Dowager, and Cixi was nowhere to be seen in all the ceremonies because she was a concubine. I mean, her son was supposed to call the empress. That's the empress, called the empress mother, and not Cixi mother. I mean, my grandmother was a concubine when she gave birth to my mother, and my mother was not supposed to call her mother, and was supposed to call the proper wife mother. So the concubine, as John said, had absolutely no status.
But in the West, we boys would have grown up very confused.
You're very confused.
By having mummy who wasn't mummy, mummy who was mummy, but who you couldn't call mummy.
Yes.
That can lead to some degree of, later in life you could be quite a confused individual.
Yes. Well, yes, I think in China as well. But in the case of Cixi, the 2 women became great friends and comrades in arms, if I may say, because what they did was they launched a coup after their husband's death, and they seized power from the 8 powerful grandees to whom the emperor and the emperor whom the emperor made regents, joint agents, to supervise his 5-year-old son. And they ousted these 8 men, and they seized the power for themselves. Now, of the 8 men, 3 were put to death. 1 was executed. The other 2 were each sent a long white silk scarf to hang themselves with. And that was supposed to be an imperial favor. It had in Chinese is called the Cibo. But they then seized the power, and that's Cixi going to the audience in the morning carried by eunuchs. And that's how they exercised the power, not on this throne, but behind the curtain, because China had a strict male-female segregation, which actually the Empress Dowager later abolished. Women were not allowed to be seen, so they couldn't even see their officials, who were all male, and they had to sit from behind the throne.
So the 5-year-old would be on the seat in front, and
Yes.
the power behind the throne was there. Now, before we go any further, we've got several concepts here that we've not really explored.
Right.
One is concubines. I mean, without going into too much gruesome detail, what was the job of a concubine? And, I mean, after all, I mean, was it just sex, or was there more to it than that?
I think sex, yes, and also to bear sons.
Sons who would almost invariably become treated as if they were the progeny of the emperor.
The emperor, they were all, the emperor's sons. And so to provide the sort of successors to the dynasty.
And eunuchs. Because what I'm interested in is one of the eunuchs she falls in love with at some point.
Yes.
And I thought all those juices were taken out when you lost your bits.
Well, the thing is...
Well, I mean, you've got to know what we're talking about.
Right, okay. Now, I, of course, like my biography of Mao, I did my research in primary documents, and there are enormous numbers of documents around about Cixi and about her dynasty. In the Forbidden City archives in Beijing alone, there are over 10 million documents. Of course, I wouldn't dream of have access to all the 10 million, but a lot of scholars have also been working on this. But from these documents, there were remarkably few slim about her affair, but I pieced together all sorts of info, and there is one chapter in the book about her affair. And in her late 20s and early 30s, and Cixi, in the world that the only men were the eunuchs and her son in that Forbidden City, because she was not allowed out. I mean, she wasn't even allowed to the to the front part of the Forbidden City. If you have been to China and to Beijing to see the Forbidden City, she never set foot on the front part of the Forbidden City because she was a woman. She was confined to the harems. Now, in the harems, there were only the eunuchs and her son, as I said. And she fell in love with a good-looking eunuch, and to tragic consequences. It was 1869, and because she was in love, she sent the eunuch out of this prison of a Forbidden City to go down the Great Canal that linked North China to the south, with the excuse of buying wedding robes for her son. And the eunuchs went out with an entourage, and that enraged the grandees, because eunuchs were never allowed to go out of the palace. And so they seized him, and they executed him, and they exposed his corpse for 3 days so the public could see he had, no male organ, because there was rumor, which turned out not to be rumor, that he was having an affair with the Empress Dowager. And the women in his eunuch's entourage were sent to the frontiers to be slaves of of the troops there, and other eunuchs in his entourage were executed. And Cixi suffered a nervous breakdown. She was, there was the description, medical descriptions in my book. She was a woman who had launched a coup and risked the punishment of death by 1,000 cuts, which was the prescribed punishment for treason, literally slowly slicing somebody to death. By the way, also a punishment that she abolished later in her reforms. But she risked her life without batting an eyelid, but she suffered a nervous breakdown after her lover was executed. And from then on, there is no document to show she had any other affairs. And I think it's quite likely that her heart was closed, so to speak. She never had any affairs because the cost was just too high.
What I like about all this is that we are seeing in Cixi, in a way, we're seeing women in power, a woman in power, in this extremely male setup, which has the resonances of Mrs. Thatcher in Britain. No, it's an extraordinary thing. Anybody who's lived through the Thatcher era and watched her interaction with men in the court, if you will, you see it all played out in this book. And there's a second thing which is also incredibly interesting, and that is, it seems to me that she prepares China for that sort of extremely strong, centralized leadership that Mao was later able to exercise as a man. I mean, she did wield incredible power. And beyond the fact that men seemed extraordinarily flaccid and pathetic, witness the way they folded up when the plot to kill her was discovered. I'm wondering how she became such an extraordinarily dominant figure in a country that was not used to seeing a woman exercise power, just as Britain wasn't used to seeing a woman exercise power.
Well, the thing is this, before her, China was ruled by these emperors. In her dynasty, Qing dynasty from 17th century, an emperor and the emperor alone made all the decisions. There wasn't even a prime minister figure. So she sort of inherited that tradition. And it's just her son, the emperor, was 5 years old. And so she became the kind of authoritarian rule. Her rule did have actually a lot in common. I think her method of rule with probably modern female rulers. In the case of Cixi, she commanded tremendous loyalty from the male grandees, officials around her. And first of all, she brought peace to China. China was torn apart by internal peasant uprisings and the external invasions, like the British invasion, which burned down the Summer Palace. And she brought peace, and she ended all that. And she, for example, the Chinese Gordon, Charles Gordon, this English Victorian warrior, I think you probably know about, helped her defeat the biggest peasant uprising in Chinese history, the Taiping, which paved the way for the Cixi era. And that man standing in the corner, Robert Hart, who was also British. Robert Hart was an Ulsterman, and Cixi made him the head of Chinese customs for as long as she was alive. She died in 1908, and Robert Hart left in 1908, having taken over the Chinese customs in 1861 after the Empress Dowager's coup. And he made a tremendous contribution, unrecognized, alas, sort of in China, largely unrecognized, made tremendous contribution to Chinese economy, contributing as much as 1/3 of the national revenue, which also made sure that the Cixi period was relatively prosperous. She brought peace and prosperity, and she earned people's, the men's respect.
But this is what's so interesting. Here are two foreigners in a country where the foreigner was certainly thoroughly suspect.
Yes.
She'd had no, seems to me, educational experience that can have told her what lay beyond the seas, if you like.
Yes.
Yet she trusted these men, and they weren't all Brits even. I mean, they were Irish, they were all sorts. And I wonder,
Yes.
was that because she despaired of the men that were in the court? What was it about her own life experience that enabled her to trust these men, but to trust the man with all the money,
Yes.
to trust Hart with looking after the money for 45 years, an extraordinary investment of human capital.
Yes. Well, you see, you mentioned earlier she had no educational background to prepare her for that. I think that may have worked in her favor because the Chinese educational system, which she also thoroughly changed when she later in her life. The Chinese education system at the time was exclusively to take a 4-year-old boy and make him memorize Confucian classics. I mean, the texts they couldn't dream of understanding. I mean, and then there was nothing else. It was just exclusively Confucian classics. As a girl, Cixi was not given that sort of education, which a lot of people at the time described as intellectual infanticide. Actually, I mean, she kept her brain supple and receptive, and offer, fresh ideas. And I think that was one reason that it fell on her to open the door of China, because the China's door was opened in 1861 after Cixi's coup. I mean, for example, this man standing in the middle is an American, and
That's Abraham Lincoln's ambassador, isn't it?
Yes,
No.
Abraham Lincoln's first ambassador to China, he was called Anson Burlingame. And when his term was over, and Cixi made him China's first ambassador to the West. So he traveled, he led his delegation with 2 Chinese deputies, 1 British, 1 French secretaries, and all over the world. And Queen Victoria wrote about the delegation in her library, in the Windsor Royal Archives. And Queen Victoria said she met the Chinese delegation whose ambassador was an American. She said, but of course, his deputies were Chinese. And Anson Burlingame then told the West, I mean, in the glowing language, how China is now opening the door and coming to the West, and how, the West and China should get together, and so on. And then she sent people abroad to, she sent children abroad, to America in this case, to receive comprehensive education. And from these people abroad, she received reports about the West. And I think being a woman, being deprived of that suffocating education, she felt herself actually quite drawn to Western ways, because and the report that, there were mountains of them in the archives, and they talked about how women were treated in the West, how they could walk arm in arm with their men, they could dance, they could swim, they could skate, and above all, they could be monarchs. I mean, her first Chinese envoy abroad wrote back and said, England is ruled by a woman. Queen Victoria. Yeah. Everybody sings her praise. And those reports couldn't but have the most sort of important impact on Cixi, because for her, no matter how capable she was, she could only rule behind the curtain. And
what about the other way around? What do the Windsor files tell you about what Queen Victoria felt when she discovered there was an empress knocking around in China?
Well, she was never mentioned. And the thing is this.
There's only one of me.
Because she was a woman. No. It's not because there was only one, but because she was a woman, and her rule had to be, all the imperial edicts had to be issued in the words of her son,
Sure.
even though the son was 5 years old. And so all the foreign envoys asked to see the ruler of China, and they were given a no because the emperor was too young, he couldn't see the foreigner, and the Empress Dowager was a woman. And she, well, in most cases, she was not even mentioned. She was a non-person. So Queen Victoria was not given at the time, at first, any information about her. It was just talking vague terms about the emperor.
I mean, obviously it makes it more saleable to say nobody else has written about her, but I mean, to what extent has she been left out of history precisely because of the role she played behind the throne?
Well, you are absolutely right, which is why she was either not talked about, or if she was talked about, invariably cast as a villain. I mean, you know, for a female ruler, and all the wrongs were blamed on her. China's defeat in the hands of Japan actually happened after she was she retired, because her problem is as soon as her son grew up, she had to go back to the harem. And you know, in the case of her, this is not her son. Her son only ruled for more than a year, and he died. And the son died because, not because, anyway, we won't go into her son yet. Then she immediately, at the death of her son, put another 3-year-old on the throne, her nephew, who she adopted. So she continued to rule from behind the curtain. Now, this was her adopted son, Emperor Guangxu. Now, then inevitably, Emperor Guangxu grew up, and so he took over, and so she retired to the harem. But Emperor Guangxu was, shall we say, you know, he was no good. He grew up in the Forbidden City. He had no desire to even step out of the Forbidden City. He never wanted to travel, didn't want to anything to do with reforms, didn't want to see a foreigner, and he was genuinely interested in just Confucian, reciting Confucian classics. And this may be because Cixi was not a good mother to the adopted son. So the emperor became very attached to the classics tutor, who dominated his life and made all the decisions for him. And then when Japan attacked China in 1894, this pair, the emperor who never got out of the Forbidden City, by the way, he had many phobias, the emperor. One was thunder. So whenever there was a thunderstorm, eunuchs would gather and shout at the top of their voice to try to drown out the thunder. So this pair was conducting China's end of the war, you know, with ironclads fought by the Empress Dowager and with a navy founded by the Empress Dowager against Japan, which had modernized, you know, which would soon be taking on the West. And of course, China was defeated. But everybody, even today, is still blaming the Empress Dowager, even though she was retired and her adopted son barred her from politics because women were not allowed to be interested in politics, theoretically.
This is where I want to pick you up because, I mean, this all happened so unbelievably recently. I mean, just over 100 years ago. And this was 30 years before the Long March and 40 years before the Revolution. How do you think it informed the China that emerged after the Revolution in any way at all?
Well, the thing is this, she brought in modernity to China. You know, everything from electricity, the railway, to the free press.
Yes, the railway was a very big thing.
Railway was a very big thing.
And very early.
Well, actually, it was delayed for 20 years because this is another story, because the Chinese in those days had this, their religion was like ancestor worship. I mean, the Chinese landscape was dominated by tombs. Each family, each clan would have its own tomb. And people believe that if they die, they would go into the tomb to join their dearest and nearest. And that took fear out of their death. But the railway was considered to be something that would disturb the dead souls that were roaming the Chinese countryside. And the Empress Dowager was superstitious. And she was also a very religious person. She believed in Buddhism, believed in Taoism, and ancestor worship. And she was afraid that the train, the engine, would disturb these dead souls. And so China didn't delay this railway until she realized that the railway could transform the Chinese economy and could link central China, landlocked middle of China, to the coast, to link up with the outside world and to export Chinese goods to the West, and which is exactly how many, many decades later China became rich. Yeah, China became rich by export, which was the idea she first conceived. And she also built China's main railway from Beijing to Canton. I mean, I don't know whether, that remains the artery of Chinese economy today. Now, okay, she brought in all this, and free press and the educational system, which she changed, completely changed to, and brought in Western educational system, Western legal systems, and of course, inevitably, the seeds of revolution. The Han Chinese then demanded majority rule. Because the Manchu rule, Cixi's rule, was the minority rule. The Manchus were only 1% of the Chinese population, and they conquered China in the 17th century, and so on. And so she inevitably ushered in a revolutionary period. And her is very much like today's China. Many people are now making a comparison between the last decades of Cixi's life with today's China. In both cases, the country have been opened and Western ideas and etc. have come in. Now, Cixi chose to be further Westernized and to introduce a parliamentary monarchy, constitutional monarchy like Britain. And she made a program to introduce the vote in 9 years, starting 1908. And of course, unfortunately, she died. But that's not the route today's regime is prepared to go on. Now, after her death, there was Republican Revolution and etc. And China's two main powerful neighbors, Japan and Russia, which featured heavily in my book about the Empress Dowager, also encroached on China and led China through the most horrible century in its long history, 20th century China. Now, Mao's rule, I mean, the subject of my previous biography, brought in at least 70 million unnecessary deaths. Now, Japan, of course, played a major role because it invaded China in the 1930s and defeated and devastated the Chiang Kai-shek's rule before Mao's rule and prepared the way for a communist takeover. And at Cixi's time, Japan was already coveting China. And earlier you mentioned murder, whether Cixi was a murderer. Indeed, she murdered her adopted son, the Emperor Guangxu, the day before she died, because when she knew she was going to die, she knew that if she had died and he was alive, China would land in the hands of Japan. And there had been a lot of intrigues and attempts of assassinations on her life. And this emperor was a weak man, and he was ready to go with the Japanese even as a puppet emperor. And so that was that's how Cixi ended her life, with the murder of her
You see,
Dr. Sang.
the one big issue which you do sort of resolve in the book, but nevertheless, I mean, here is this woman who rules from behind the throne, never seen, never comes out, and yet has this total power. Now, you contrast this with Mrs. Thatcher, who was always out, but, you know, I mean, one of the things about Mrs. Thatcher, and I go into this simply because I'm intrigued as to whether this may have similarities, is that if you think about her, she always essentially had an all-male cabinet. And she would, I think, look at people, at the men round the cabinet, who were all public school educated, who identified her as the only female who'd ever really cracked the whip in their lives, and that was matron at their boarding schools. Because in growing up, these politicians had only ever really experienced, in their vital teenage years, not a concubine or anything like that, they had only experienced matron, with whom they generally didn't have carnal activity. Right? But nevertheless, she was the only female thing, so that when they were confronted with a woman sitting at the cabinet table and looking at them, some of them thought that she was signalling to them, Kenneth, have you washed behind your ears? What about those fingernails? And she had complete dominance over these guys. They very rarely ever challenged her. And this is what's so extraordinary about these men who were gathered in her court. She, of course, as you said right at the beginning, cleaned the shed and got rid of 4 or 5 of them. But then she didn't seem to need to murder people much.
No, that's right. Yes. No.
How did she manage to get these men who never had to see her
Well, I think
to
first
do
of
what
all,
she wanted?
Yes, I mean, first of all, she made wise decisions which made them feel she was really able, she was really an asset to their empire. I mean, there were people who disobeyed her, who didn't think much of her. I document in the book,
Yeah.
like there were these princes. So she brought them around by demonstrating to them she was the person who was the best defender of the empire. I mean, she had a war with France in the 1880s. And she marked the border with China, with foreign countries, which remain the borders of today. And also she was also not above using her female charm. You probably have heard of these boxers, the Boxer Rebellion, when she made a wrong decision against the advice of most of the reformist men. And she was driven out of the Forbidden City. You know, this is the allied forces of 8 countries entering the Forbidden City. But in exile, and so on, when she seemed to be vulnerable, she still commanded great loyalty. And one among many reasons, and one reason was that she sort of invariably burst into tears when she saw this man, a picture of vulnerability, making them feel that they would be, she was this woman who needs protection, and pretending to accept their counsel when she actually had her own idea. And also, she made people adore her, she made people fear her. I mean, after she died, when China became a republic, the first president of the Republican China, who was a general, who said, the only person he was afraid of was the Empress Dowager. I mean, eventually she emerged from the behind the curtain, and she had a terrific judgment. And this former president said, for some reason, the moment, I mean, she seemed to be able to make a judgment, an accurate judgment of the man kneeling in front of her, and he was made to feel if he was not being straight with her, he would be in deadly trouble. I mean, as you say, she actually rarely killed anyone. I mean, in all her rule for nearly half a century, and the people she killed, sort of not leaving aside armed rebellions and so on, were in their lower dozens. Unlike in Mao's I mean, well, by comparison, by comparison with her successors, Mao basically murdered nearly, well over 70 million Chinese in peacetime. By comparison, her rule was positively benign, even though she also murdered people. Now, and also she made people fear her, but not hate her. Somebody who is that politician or statesman said the trick is to make people fear you, but not hate you. And she had the knack of making her subjects love her and fear her, but not hate her, except some people who plotted to assassinate her, which I described in the book. And she was, of course, not a shrinking violet. She had a wrist like steel. She also killed them.
Now, we have the privilege of reading this in this country, but it is not published in China. What do you think the Chinese now make of her and will make of you writing about her?
Well, the thing is, both my previous books, Wild Swans and the biography of Mao, are banned in China. So with this book, first of all, I have to translate it into Chinese, which is something, I feel I'm
so
both...
So you write in English?
I wrote in English, like my biography of Mao, I wrote with John, my husband. By the way, with the Mao biography, we divided our research by language. I dealt with the Chinese language sources, and John, my husband, speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. And that's how we also had tremendous fun. If we had a little time, I'd talk about our interviews of people. Now, that book is also banned. With this book, I have been translating it into Chinese, and it will be published this coming summer in Taiwan and Hong Kong. So in Hong Kong, fortunately, is still very much separate from mainland China. So many copies will have gone into China. I don't know whether...
But it's not that subversive, is it?
Well, it's not subversive. It's not that subversive, indeed, particularly
so
compared
what's the fear?
to...
They don't want her back.
I think they don't want her back. She showed them up, one reason, because she was the person who was going to introduce the vote to China, which nobody, certainly not the communists, are prepared to do. Now, the other thing is, of course, they won't want to raise my profile. Mm-hmm. So, my books.
People
might want to know the other books.
There'll be a demand for the others.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Mao's portrait is still on Tiananmen. The current leaders still claim to be Mao's successor. Mao is still, his face is on every Chinese banknote. His corpse is still in the center of the Chinese capital for people to worship. And neither he nor his successors have said a word of apology to the Chinese people for the 70 million deaths. And, if I may say...
Before we open it up then, let me ask you a question. Then, given all the research you've done, given your China-watching head, are we entering the Chinese century, or do you think it will not go quite according to plan?
Well, I don't think the Chinese regime has this ambition, the regime itself, Beijing has this ambition to dominate the world, unlike Mao, who did have the ambition to dominate the world. And the current regime is just pragmatic. I think they wanted to have no trouble in China, to keep their rule.
They do, in fact, have a lot of trouble.
They have a lot of trouble.
I noticed there are 189,000 registered protests. That means there'll be 1 million unregistered. That's a lot of protests.
The trouble with Vietnam, as you can see,
Japan,
the Philippines, and so on. It's not. I don't think they have the trouble, nor are they unrealistic enough to think that is that will be the case, because it's not going to be the case. I mean, you're talking about the GDP, but maybe China looks very big. But in the country itself, there are so numerous problems, and also problems that are not like in a democracy. I mean, you have lots of problems, but somehow they can all be shaken out and being resolved somehow. And in China, little problems can explode out of control and can bring down the regime, if they don't handle it too well. So I think actually they're quite realistic. I mean, nobody is thinking about the possibility of really China dominating the world.
Well, let's open it up. Who would like to come in? There's a hand right at the back in the corner in a check shirt. The microphones are headed out east and west. Over in this corner, right over there. If you keep your hand up, because otherwise it won't reach you.
Thank you very much. I did have the pleasure of reading at least part of your book when it was broadcast not so very long ago. And I was very interested in the story of the two of them. That's to say, the Empress back in 1861, who was not the mother of the Dowager Empress's child, and her. They actually spent quite a long time together, didn't they? And although the Dowager Empress may have been the leading light in it, am I right in thinking that for really quite a few years they, so to speak, ruled in tandem from behind the curtain?
Yes. When your quote, I was led by my evidence. And when I discovered what their relationship, the relationship of these two women was like, I was quite surprised, because that wasn't the general picture of the harem. People somehow think of harem as a place where women stabbing each other's back and, all their malicious, things against each other. But in fact, it wasn't like that. I mean, these two actually became friends, and they plotted the coup together. And then after the coup, they ruled together for 20 years until 1881, when the Empress Zhen, until the Empress died. Of course, people say Cixi murdered her, but medical records from the archives have proved definitively, and the courtiers' diaries, that she had died of a stroke. And when they were ruling together, I mean, they had this division of work, which had all been proved by documents, and which was quite very interesting. I mean, these two women together, because Cixi was the strategic thinker, and she basically ran things. And the Empress Dowager dealt with, if we might say, the chores, administrative work, because the Empress job also included in those days mountains of administration, officials to be appointed, criminals to be brought to justice according to the law. Then everyone had to be approved by the emperor. The emperor, in a country which was then had a third of the world's population. So the empress dealt with all these issues, and Cixi dealt with the modernization of China. And they were really great friends. So that struck me as something that changed a kind of prejudice against kind of all women harem.
Yes, the lady here, and then there's another one next to her. So there's two together.
Thank you very much for a most interesting and engaging presentation. You mentioned early on about your grandmother, that she was a concubine. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about her life and how it compared, for example, to the Dowager's life.
My grandmother, I wrote about my grandmother, of course, in Wild Swans.
Buy one while stocks last. Carry on.
Sorry. Yes. She died in the Cultural Revolution, and her death was the most painful spot in my heart. And because we were brought up, I was brought up by my grandmother, and my parents were communist officials, and they were always working, and they weren't there. And then in the Cultural Revolution, my grandmother, she saw how my mother was suffering, because my mother had joined the communists when she was 15. And my grandmother became a concubine when she was 15, when my mother joined the communists when she was 15. And in the Cultural Revolution, she was under tremendous pressure to denounce my father, who had spoken up against Mao and against the Cultural Revolution. So my father was arrested, tortured, and driven insane. And my grandmother, and my mother was under pressure to denounce my father, but my mother refused. She stood by my father. And as a result, she was put through over 100 of those ghastly denunciation meetings, which were an everyday feature in China in 1966 when Mao launched the Cultural Revolution, and in the following years. And basically, the victims would be stood on the stage, and their arms were ferociously twisted to the back, like that, and their heads were ferociously pushed down, and they were kicked and beaten. And my mother was made to kneel on broken glass. She was paraded in the streets when children spat at her and threw stones at her. And I remember the day very well, because when people told my grandmother, she fainted in front of my eyes. And my mother was her whole life, because my mother was the only daughter. And my grandmother lived for my mother. And so she fell ill. And hospitals were not running properly in the Cultural Revolution, and I wrote about all this in Wild Swans. And she wasn't given proper treatment, and so she died, aged 60. I mean, she had been of very good health, but. And she died, so that's and the image she died. My mother was in detention. She was allowed home just for a few days to be with my grandmother. And my grandmother, her memory was that she was subjected to those ghastly denunciation meetings on the high table. And she said she fell from the table because she couldn't stand still. And that's how she got ill. But in fact, she wasn't. I mean, but that was the image. That was the image of everybody who's been through that period. Well, the thing is this. Okay, now, for many years, I didn't want to write Wild Swans, and because, the past was too painful. And I came to Britain in 1978, after Mao died, and China again began to open up, like the Empress Dowager's time. And for the first time in 1978, scholarships were awarded on academic basis, and I sat for a national exam. I did reasonably well, so I came to Britain. And I didn't, I had always wanted to be a writer when I was growing up. But I couldn't, because all writers were persecuted under Mao. And when I was in Britain, I could become a writer. But at that time, the desire to become a writer just left me, because I had come to this completely new world. And I didn't want to look back and look inward to these ghastly things, and I want to spend every minute absorbing this new world. And, I had tremendous fun when I first came. and we were all wearing this Mao suit, this sort of Mao uniform, and there were 14 of us. We were not allowed to go out on our own. We had to move in a group, so we were quite a sight in the London streets. And also, we were told not to go to this and that, the other. And one thing we were told not to do was to go to an English pub. Because the Chinese translation for pub, 酒吧, suggested somewhere indecent with nude women gyrating. So I told her to the pub. But of course, I was torn with curiosity. I think in this, the Empress Dowager was also full of curiosity, which is why she liked Western ways. You know, she ride a tricycle, she had a pair of skating shoes, and she wanted to go into a hot air balloon, and so on. And I was full of curiosity. I wanted to go see a pub. And I spotted this pub opposite our college. So one day I sneaked out of the college. I darted across the road. I pushed the door of the pub open. Of course, I saw nothing of the kind, only some men sitting there drinking beer. And I was rather disappointed. And it was absolutely riveting, you know, life. You know, when I learned English in China in the 1970s, when things became better, in the last years of Mao's rule, and China had been completely closed for decades. I mean, even our teachers, English teachers, have never seen a foreigner before. And so our textbooks were direct translations of Chinese texts. And because the Chinese in those days, when we bumped into each other, we say, 吃饭了吗？上哪儿去? Which means, where are you going? Have you eaten? And those were the English greetings I learned. So when I first arrived in London, I used to go around asking people where they were going and whether they had eaten. I mean, you can imagine what fun I had. You know, everything was new. It was like landing in Mars. And so I didn't want to write anything. But in 1988, my mother came to London to stay with me. And she stayed with me for 6 months. And she talked every day. She talked about my grandmother's feats, but I had no idea how the foot binding took place. And it was my mother who told me how this was done by the daughter's mother.
Do you carry her shoes wherever you go, or you brought them today thinking you might need to produce them?
Well, I think I know I was going to produce them because now the Empress Dowager, first I established this sympathy for her, because considering everybody thought she was a villain, but I just the fact that she banned the foot binding was a very important factor for me.
Let's have the next one that was, yeah.
You've highlighted some of the pain of the 20th century, and I just wonder, had Cixi lived longer and had the opportunity to introduce the constitutional monarchy, do you think that things would have turned out differently, or do you think the void that she left would have meant the inevitability of these events?
I don't know. The thing is, she certainly was determined to do that, but she faced some, I think, pretty insurmountable problems. One was the rising Japan, and also the rising Soviet Russia. You know, the October Revolution was 1917, and Soviet Russia was determined to turn China communist. So these two powerful countries were encroaching on China. I don't think even Cixi, able as she was, could have resisted this, could have handled these two powers successfully. And also, I think her deadly weakness was that she was a Manchu. I mean, her dynasty was a Manchu dynasty. I regard that as an insurmountable problem. I mean, once the country became a public or vote or something, it's most unlikely a Manchu. I mean, even if they voted for her, they would not vote for another Manchu successor.
Yes, from a Manchu to a man. Yeah.
Just to pursue the parallels between Margaret Thatcher and Cixi, they both, in a sense, came to power at a moment of national humiliation, or what was perceived as national humiliation. And that means, in fact, the discredit, to some extent, of the existing political class. I mean, Britain was regarded in the 70s as the sick man of Europe. Another parallel would be Kemal Ataturk in Turkey. Turkey was the sick man of Europe in the late 19th century. I wonder how much in China there was, in a sense, an understanding that something had to be done, no matter who did it. Was there, in fact, a movement of modernization which wasn't just, as it were, the Empress or the concubine, but in fact was more widely rooted?
You're absolutely right. There was at the time a general consensus among the elite that something had to be done. I mean, when she launched her coup and ousted these 8 regents, and the British envoy to China, who's the brother of Lord Elgin, the son of the Elgin of the Elgin marble repute or disrepute. And the brother, his younger brother, was the British envoy to Beijing, and he wrote back to the Foreign Office. He was amazed how smoothly the coup had gone and how few lives had been lost and how lack of instability in China. I mean, what that says is there was already a general consensus that we can't continue as before, and something must be done.
And she did have really good people, in actual fact. And there were good, we've highlighted the bad people, but there were really good people in her court.
Yes. Well, Cixi, that's her, maybe you call it female intelligence, not intuitive intelligence or something. She has a terrific eye for people. She has a terrific judgment. She really could, spot a reformer, a good people.
But I get the feeling that you take a slightly dim view of our male desire to raise Mrs. Thatcher into this equation.
Well, the thing is, I think there are.
Of course, you're not a man. That helps.
Now, I think, of course, there is one major difference that Lady Thatcher's rule was all the time legitimate. She was voted in, but Cixi never had the legitimacy, and she entirely relied on proving herself, which was why that was almost modern. Because all the emperors had been, had automatic power. She didn't have automatic power. She had to prove herself, and that was the difference. I think a major difference.
I would argue Mrs. Thatcher had to prove herself in a different way, and
Probably,
in many ways, if she hadn't had the Falkland War, or even the miners' strike to do it, she might not have prevailed.
Yes.
She might not have prevailed without the Falkland War.
I have to defer to your wisdom.
No, I have.
I have noticed.
I have no wisdom. I'm just here.
Yes.
I'm just here to ask questions. Here in the autumnal glow. It's coming.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to know. You said you did all the research and got all these documents, went back to the originals. How?
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Well, here is the complex situation of myself vis-a-vis China, which is my books are banned, and I myself is very much persona non grata. But I have been given, I have been tolerated to go back and see my mother once a year. This is since the publication of the Mao biography, and thanks to the help of British Foreign Office. So my mother is in her mid-80s. She's frail. She can't travel. She needs her children to go back and see her. So I'm sort of tolerated to go back and see my mother. And but of course, when I go back, it's always under surveillance, and I give the undertake that I will not be engaged in political activities, and I will not try to promote my books, and I will not go to any meetings. I will not even attend dinner parties. But in exchange, as well as seeing my mother, I can do my research about the Empress Dowager, because she is a history. She died in 1908, as you said. She's not
and they
that.
knew you were doing it.
They know I'm doing it. Everything I do is no secret. I'm not engaged in any clandestine things.
You're not behind the curtain.
Certainly not behind the curtain. And so I was able to see some scholars and even to visit the archive that contains archive documents about her. But that's not even the main channel of my research, because ever since Mao's death, from late 1970s, Chinese scholars and historians have been working on the archives and on the courtiers' diaries, contemporaries' memoirs, and et cetera, all these primary documents, and they have been publishing them, and they have been digitalizing them. So most of the research actually is done sitting in my study comfortably in London and bringing up imperial decrees onto the screen.
But this is very interesting because, I mean, basically they regard her as a bad force, not somebody to be celebrated or even remembered. I mean the authorities.
Yes.
And yet they encourage this research, not your research,
Yes,
but the research by these scholars.
Yes. Well,
What's going on here?
Well, the thing is, her bad image is not just a communist propaganda. It's been inherited from the Republicans. And I dare say my book probably will be more controversial in Taiwan, who are the Republicans before the communists, than mainland China. And in mainland China, the scholars, having done all this work over the years, have actually come to the consensus, large consensus, that something has to be done about her image, because anyone who has access to primary sources can see what she has done.
We're into the last 5 minutes, and there's a hand waving over there. Are there any other anxious hands? And there's two over here. So we'll take a little bunch and see what happens.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for opening up with all these wonderful details of your own personal history, which is much appreciated. In my own small wanderings around China, I echo, what you were saying about people not understanding the full history, of course, and particularly their reverence and worship still of Mao, which I just couldn't believe everywhere I went. But I'm just remembering, which I've no doubt got not in detail correctly, that Mao said something about being told 50 million will die along the Yangtze during one of his operations, and he said, what's 50 million? But I'm hearing that in places like Shanghai, the young Chinese have found ways of circumnavigating the barriers on the net. And they have ways of really listening, finding out about anything. I don't know if this is true, but that's what I'm hearing. I'm sure you would know more. And so maybe your words and the truth and all of the real history will come through. How long can they keep the lid on?
I want to park that. I'm going to keep that as one, because we haven't got much time left. So I'm going to take these two over here. Yeah. Ladies first.
What sort of education would Cixi have had, given the amazing things? Was she just left as a child to play, or what happened?
Good. And the third question.
Having been classified as a subversive, would you actually like to be a bit of a subversive, given the chance?
So, perhaps the first is, now in China, if you wanted to find out things on the internet, you can. I mean, Chinese tourists go to Hong Kong and Taiwan. What do? They buy banned books because they can't buy everything else in China. The tragedy is really how many people who actually don't want to find out. They don't want to know. They don't want their cozy, accepting world being upset because you can't do anything about it. And I'm sure you have heard about the recent arrests and so on. Just wanting to know, you are already down the road of committing a crime. Now, the thing is, what I want to be subversive. Well, the thing is, I think I realize my books are subversive. I mean, but that I didn't set out to be. I don't have a mission to be a subversive. In fact, I'm not an activist. I'm not trying to do anything, whatever, the activist way. I mean, I love writing books. I love writing, finding out, getting to the bottom of things, finding out the truth. Of course, the truth is subversive. That's sort of slightly gray area.
And Cixi's education as a child.
Well, she learned a little reading and writing, but in those days, the Chinese language and education is so difficult, and so she was classified as a semi-illiterate. But after she came to power, she engaged eunuchs, educated eunuchs and doctors to teach her. So she then became quite, she was quite versed in the classics. But she, of course...
How did one become a eunuch? You could be highly educated. No, I mean, I know the mechanics, but I mean...
Yes. Yes. Well, I would spare you of the details, of course. But I would tell you, usually there were a couple of counties near Beijing, and that were traditionally supplying eunuchs to the court. And the eunuchs became eunuchs or castrated when they were children. They were taken because they were so poor and their family wanted to give them a better life and by serving the court. And they would be taken to special practitioners. And of course, practitioners charge heavy fees. So if you don't get promoted as a eunuch, you might spend half your life paying back the debt. So some fathers would castrate their own sons. So it was the cruelest and horrible practice. Cixi, in her reforms, contemplated stopping this practice by first, open up the court, so there would be to allow the court to have non-eunuchs. But, things are so ironic. It was the eunuchs in the court who were against it. They launched a weeping campaign and stopped her. But of course, in a few years' time, the practice was stopped. A few years after her death.
Well, I don't think we need any weeping campaign here. We can only express ourselves incredibly grateful to you for a really wonderful hour and a quarter tour d'horizon of a remarkable era, an extraordinary woman, as you are too.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, you've already thanked Jung Chang and Jon Snow. I would just like to add ours on behalf of Charleston for an absolutely riveting session, spellbinding. Thank you so much for introducing us to the Empress Cixi and also for sharing some very intimate stories of your own. Thank you for dressing the part, and thank you, John, for dressing the part with your ties and socks as well. May I just ask you to remain sitting for just another 2 or 3 minutes while we'll take Jung Chang and John out. Jung Chang will be at the bookstall and will be very ready to sign books and to continue the conversation.